You find me this morning in my Andy from CBeebies hat because I've been thinking about the great outdoors and specifically climbing trees, as you do. You see, stories resonate as we've been hearing, and the one of Zacchaeus takes me back about a quarter of a century to when I said those immortal words that no parent longs to hear to my dad. Dad, I'm bored. Well, he had a suggestion that I don't think I'll necessarily repeat to Nathan, and certainly comes with a don't try this at home disclaimer. He said to me, if you're bored, why don't you climb some trees? Now, being 11 years old or so, I thought this was brilliant, but it's not a clean process, it's not an easy process, it's not dignified. I'd come down and I'd have tree sap all over my hands and bits of tree in my hair. Yes, I did used to have hair. And yet this is where we find Zacchaeus, climbing a tree. So what was the setting that brings this about? And who was Zacchaeus? We don't know a great deal about Zacchaeus, but not for the first time in Luke's Gospel. In verse 2, he uses a really modern way of introducing someone. You can draw your own parallels, but for me it's a bit like this, the dreaded conference badge. And it might say something like, man called Zacchaeus is a chief tax collector and he's wealthy. You see, Luke is a master storyteller. He wants to emphasize the wealthy part. Chief tax collectors were not popular people. They were widely considered to be embezzling funds, and they were agents of the Roman state. And yet this man is desperate to see Jesus. Could it be that he wants to leave this story behind? Zacchaeus is desperate to see Jesus, this rabbi that draws huge crowds of people and spends time with social outcasts and people on the margins of society. But Zacchaeus knows that he's a short man. And so we read in verse 4 that he's willing to defenestrate his dignity, to throw it out of the window. To see a glimpse of Jesus, he's willing to do two things that a respectable Jewish man shouldn't do. So he runs, he's willing to run and climb a tree. So he's a man called Zacchaeus, he's a chief tax collector, he's wealthy, and he's looking for a new story. He's tired, he's embarrassed, but he did it. And then the ultimate story changer, Jesus, turns it all on its head. And he calls Zacchaeus by name and tells him to come down because I must stay at your house. In verse 5, we read that Jesus says to Zacchaeus, come down from the tree because I must stay at your house. And in verse 6, we read that Zacchaeus is delighted by this. Now, this might seem a bit strange to us, but in the ancient Near East, Jesus was actually giving Zacchaeus a tremendous honour in front of the entire crowd by inviting himself to Zacchaeus' house. You see, Zacchaeus had climbed up the tree desperate for a glimpse of Jesus, and he was a social pariah. When he comes down from the tree, he's going to be listened to by Jesus, and he's honoured in front of the entire crowd. You see, Jesus knew Zacchaeus' name and his entire story, and yet despite that, he says, I must come to stay with you. Now, inevitably in verse 7, Jesus is questioned. The people around grumble and mutter, why is Jesus off to the house of this sinner? Seems, if anything, they're stuck on the old story of Zacchaeus. But Zacchaeus himself gets it. He knows he's been blessed by incredible grace. But he also knows that this new story Jesus has provided for him needs a plot. And so he responds with faith-filled action. He says straight away that he'll give half of his possessions to the poor, and if he's defrauded anybody, he'll repay them 4 times over. And in verse 9, Jesus affirms that change. Jesus affirms this new plot for Zacchaeus' story by calling him a son of Abraham. In his book Storybearer, Phil Knox challenges us to think about God's story and our own story and ways in which we can tell those. always reminds me of 1 Peter 3:15, always having an answer. And Phil talks about the 4 points bracelet. It's a reminder of God's story, and we can think how it relates to the story of Zacchaeus. The first part is that God loves us, and we see that in the story today. He knows Zacchaeus by name, he seeks him out, he wants to bless him. But we know as well that we have sinned, we've fallen short of the standards we should meet, and we see that in Zacchaeus. But Jesus goes to the cross to redeem us, and although he doesn't go to the cross in this particular story, Jesus humbles himself. He takes a risk in front of this crowd of people. And then finally, we're left with a choice of how we respond. Zacchaeus knew he needed a new plot for his story. And I think of my own story. I think the idea of a loving God was placed in a box marked "Do Not Open." And it took a long time before I was willing to come and see all the ways in which God's amazing and extravagant grace had blessed my life. So I think today's story challenges us to think about the grace we've received from Jesus in all the unexpected and extravagant ways that that's happened. But also I think it challenges us to think about the people on the margins. Who are the Zacchaeuses? Who are the people at the top of trees, on the margins, struggling for a glimpse of Christ? Are we doing enough to look for the people on the margins, to look for the people clambering up the proverbial tree? Because so often when we look for the people on the margins, we look for the people who are outcasts, we might just find Jesus is looking back at us.